Welcome to the Future Generations podcast. I'm Pablo Mancias.
And I'm KP.
This is a prophecy.
Season 2, Episode 1, and we're talking about Sundown Towns. And there's a trigger warning for our audience today. We're going to be talking about some heavy material here. And for those of you who don't know what a sundown town is, we're going to read some definitions here because it can be sanitized just depending on what source you're getting it from. This is the Webster's definition of a sundown town: a place or jurisdiction that prohibits or discourages a certain class of people, typically a certain race or ethnicity, from living there or remaining there after sundown, or in some cases, from visiting during the day.
And I'm going to read another definition that kind of emphasizes on the violence of it. So sundown towns are all white communities, neighborhoods, or counties that excluded Blacks and other minorities through the use of discriminatory laws, harassment, threats, or use of violence. And although the term most often referred to the forced exclusion of African Americans, the history of sundown towns also includes prohibition against Jews, Native Americans, the Chinese, Japanese, and other minority groups.
Yeah, and I think that's more fitting, and like you said, because it has some more references to the violence that was involved with these historic definition, but also how endemic it is and how structural it is, because we're going to be talking about some situations where there was definitely law enforced through the structure of racism. And here's the thing is that this is something most people who do know what they are associated with the past or the Jim Crow South and with Black identity. And it's not in the past. San Antonio Express News had this story about a Black jogger who got detained, and his name was Matthias Ometu. We're going to take a look at this little clip about him.
A new lawsuit from a Black jogger detained by San Antonio police, even after they determined he was not the man they were looking for. Matthias Ometu is suing Chief William McManus and the officers involved in his arrest. Ometu alleges SAPD violated his constitutional rights by arresting him without probable cause and using excessive force. The incident happened in August of 2020. Officers were looking for a man who allegedly punched a woman when they pulled up next to Ometu. They handcuffed him when he refused to give his name. Ometu said he resisted when officers tried to force him into a patrol car, leading to a struggle. Tonight, the city of San Antonio had this to say about the lawsuit, telling KINS 5 the police chief, quote, conducted a review of the incident and found that the officers acted appropriately. We will seek a speedy resolution to this matter in the courts.
And again, we see this pattern of the trauma passed down from sundown towns, from systemic racism. And there was actually a local group in San Antonio that issued a travel warning for African American people, and they called San Antonio a sundown town. And this is the activist group's name was the Defund SAPD Coalition. So there's 4 levels within the group's advisory. There's exercise normal precaution, exercise increased caution, reconsider travel, and do not travel. And the activist group Defund SAPD believes that San Antonio is in the reconsider travel phase. The reason why this is important, right, is we need to take into account the pain and the trauma of our Black relatives, right? Because there is some trauma that we will never understand. All people of color have faced trauma, right? And I think the more we listen to each other and the lasting impacts of that trauma, we'll be able to have these conversations with each other without lashing or bleeding onto each other. Because the whole point of it is to heal and to come together, right?
Right. It's not a competition.
It's not a competition. But at the same time, we also have to acknowledge these difficult conversations. So I thought it was important to bring that to light because San Antonio is most known for its Hispanic community. So people, I think when it comes to topics about race, when I've heard other people's perspectives, they tend not to take into account if it doesn't affect them. But again, we need to take into account the pain and the legacy that our Black relatives are feeling. Because if there's an activist group that called San Antonio a sundown town, we need to sit down and have a conversation about what's going on.
Right. And, that's talking about Sundown Towns, it's something I knew about. I was aware about as a child because I grew up on the east side of Lubbock, which is literally separated by the railroad tracks and
Mm-hmm.
I-27.
Mm-hmm.
And I even worked at a liquor store with an older elderly white man who, referred to it as N-word town.
Mm-hmm.
The east side of Lubbock was all called N-word town. And he would tell me that like just freely because it's the time that he grew up, and he was like, but that's how it was back then,
And that's always how people justify
Yeah,
it.
always justify it,
Mm-hmm.
even if like you look at them weird when they say the N-word.
Mm-hmm.
And he's just like, well, but that's,
Mm-hmm.
in defense, that's how it was back then. But I mean, that's not a defense. I knew from experiences with my parents' coworkers who were Black, and they would travel for vacation through what we know as the Jim Crow South or the Sun Belt, and in some cases it's even called the Black Belt, that runs from East Texas all the way to Florida,
Mm-hmm.
that they just wouldn't stop until they got to Orlando. And if they did stop, they had that green book,
Mm-hmm.
and they knew where was safe. And this is a book that was published back in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
They knew where was safe for them to stop. Otherwise, they just didn't stop at all.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a real reality. This is in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
This is not, Jim Crow South 1960, Alabama or
Mm-hmm.
Florida. This was in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And then this incident that we were just talking about happened in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it's very much still a part of systems that we have in place that, because we don't talk about them, they stay in place.
Exactly. And it's also caused a lot of fear
Mhm.
in our communities, right? So it's important that we understand where this fear is coming from, like when we listen to stories from our elders, because sometimes when we listen to narratives, they might not want to share that trauma because it's like they have to relive it again, and that's understandable, right? So there should be an appropriate way to discuss this. When you're bringing up the example about the Green Book, I immediately thought of when I was growing up, we had this radio station and they used a code for any time ice was around. And at the time, I didn't understand. I would just ask my parents, like, what do they mean by limones? And it was code for ice is around. So, in other words, be safe.
Yeah.
So, we've always had to come up with ways to protect our community because the systems in place are not protecting us.
Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. And I don't know why, but it just triggered something in my head, a memory of something just recent, that I'm going to Brownsville in Boca Chica
Mhm.
and organizing with some workers out there that are, resisting SpaceX and the liquid natural gas companies, that they used to use Boca Chica Beach. Undocumented people used to use Boca Chica Beach all the time because you don't have to pay to be on that beach. It was public, and
Mhm.
people would access it from the highway there. And now that SpaceX is there, they put a checkpoint coming out of Boca Chica. There never was a checkpoint there, but now that SpaceX is there, so these people have no longer have access to that beach.
Uh-huh.
And so, I mean, that's kind of similar in those ways because it's a system involved that separates people of a certain ethnicity, nationality, race, even. It separates them from the general community. And I guess that's what we've come to find out in our research. It's not just something that's a phenomenon in Black communities. It's happening to, it's happened to Jewish people, Asian people, Native people, and it's all a different experience. They are very similar, and it's very important to know that it's not just isolated to certain areas, and it's different.
And it also begs the question, going back, why isn't this taught? Because if this was taught and people did not find out about this history later on in life, then maybe they could put the pieces back together about that generational trauma that affects people of color, because using phrases like it's in the past, it happened a long time ago, really invalidates that pain, right? Invalidates that violence that occurred for people of color.
Yeah, and the trauma that's lasting.
Because we see it repeating.
Yeah,
it's a cycle that's repeating. So it's not going to stop repeating unless we actually have those real conversations.
Yeah, I just want to tie that into one thing because, like, I stopped teaching in a public school in Texas because I taught social studies. And there's just things you're not allowed to say because of this legislations that's been passed geared towards fighting critical race theory.
Mm-hmm.
But critical race theory was developed at the collegiate level in law schools to look at these systems
Mm-hmm.
and to dismantle them because of their origins with violence, racism, and dehumanization of certain groups.
So is it a way of reparations?
I mean, I would say yes. Personally, I don't think reparation doesn't necessarily have to be monetary if we dismantle the systems that keep people disenfranchised. That's freedom,
Mm-hmm.
and that's invaluable. But yeah, I would think of it as reparations in some way.
Or probably like the start of reparations,
Yes,
right?
right.
Because when it comes to genocide and language is lost, culture lost, lives lost, how is there anything that can actually repair that?
Repair that, yeah.
And that's what we want our listeners to get from this. Sometimes the most important thing you could do as an ally isn't marching, isn't leading a conference, it's listening.
Right. Sometimes people think it's saying the right things too,
Uh-huh.
being in the right spaces.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very much like you said, it's a lot more listening
Mm-hmm.
and it's observing. And that could be the truest support. It's just sometimes just listening and watching and then, knowing that maybe you don't need to speak sometimes. Maybe your job as an ally is to amplify or to support someone else's speech and voice.
Exactly, because that's the most powerful thing you could do as an ally. You can make space for an oppressed group to speak, because many of the times we do not get to voice our opinion. Many of the times our experiences that we've grown up with are invalidated. So the most powerful thing you could do is listen and have empathy when you listen too, because if you're listening to debate, if you're listening to argue, to make a point, you're not listening with intent.
Mm-mm. And in some ways, you're probably not even listening. You're just hearing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're not processing it in a full way. You're just like hearing it to respond. It's
Exactly.
waiting to speak
Uh-huh.
is really what you're doing. And that does remind me, and I love that you said invalidates your trauma and invalidates your pain, your perspective of who you are, your identity.
Mhm.
Those things are everything that the school system did to me when I was young, when it, wanting to validate my own identity as a Native person, because
Mhm.
those books didn't even include my people in Texas Indian lessons.
Mhm.
And when it did, it mentioned tribes that were displaced because of Western expansion, because of the Trail of Tears. Those are the tribes that ended up here in Texas and now have recognition. And I remember being a kid and my dad was like, this is who our people are. And I was like, I've never heard of that before. I'm
Mhm.
being a kid. And like, because of that education, that bad education, it wasn't until I was in college, because people will go to my dad to validate certain Native things because he's a resource here in Texas.
Mhm.
And so like Texas Parks and Wildlife called my dad and they were like, there are some Native drawings in this man-made lake in Lake Allen Henry. The water level has dropped and we're just seeing them now. We want to see if you can send somebody out there. My dad was in California at the time working for the POMO, so he couldn't go. So he sent me, and I just bought this nice camera when I was in college. I was trying to be a documentary filmmaker. So I went out there and I got all these pictures and video.
Mhm.
And one of the stories that I grew up hearing from my family about India, was it Indio Patarajada,
Mhm.
the Indian with the cut foot, was a story that we were told that's how they used to keep natives in the missions, to keep us. They would cut our Achilles heel so we couldn't run off.
Mm.
And I saw a cave painting with a black figure with a cross on its chest,
Mhm.
and then a bunch of Native people around with blood coming out of their feet.
Uh-huh.
And for me, like, that's our history book.
Yeah.
It's in the land. It's in the teachings. It's in what our elders tell us. And here it is on the wall
Uh-huh.
in this location. And that was an aha moment for me, because all of that bad education that I had growing up made me question really what is my dad telling me? Like,
Uh-huh.
there's no books out
Yeah.
there. And there were books. I just
Yeah.
didn't know where to look. I didn't find that stuff out until later on in college, when
Uh-huh.
I was a little bit freer to study what I wanted to.
Uh-huh.
And here is like not only a validation of who I was, but the validation of our culture, like
Mm-hmm.
being so authentic, so honest that here is a story that's been passed down to my family and it's a fact.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And our ancestors gave it to us on the wall. So
Mm-hmm.
that was a real big thing for me. And I would want to just add that because we're not taught these things about the Sundown Towns, and we can't truly claim our identity as who we are in this country if we don't have those stories to help us grow.
Yeah, and in your case, you were able to go to your father, right?
Yeah.
And he was able to pass that down,
Yeah.
that information down to you. And I'm thinking of our listeners who might be on their reconnection journey, or there's been more talk about reconnection and what it means to them, and they don't have that resource,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
where they're looking for guidance and they're looking for a way to heal that trauma and what that looks like for them, right? And
Mhm.
the advice that I would give them is make sure that you go to the appropriate source and you get your information from elders, because that there's so much information out there that might not be accurate, right? Especially with something as sensitive as history.
Again, we're talking about the Sundown Towns and the definitions and what people might associate it with, you know, being the Jim Crow South, the Sun Belt, that area from East Texas all the way to Florida. There are some Western sundown towns that aren't even associated with the African American experience
Mm-hmm.
and have to do with Native people that we found out about. And there's this wonderful article about the Washoe in Nevada,
Mm-hmm.
and it has a awesome clip from KUNC, an NPR affiliate there in Nevada, that we encourage you guys to listen to. All the information that we are citing today we'll have in the description, so you guys can look at it on your own. And we got a chance to listen to that a story, and it talks about how they created not reservations, but colonies,
Mm-hmm.
separate communities
Mm-hmm.
for the Washoe natives outside of Lake Tahoe,
Mm-hmm.
and all of these sacred sites. They're sacred sites to these people. They've been there forever, but they've been separated,
Mm-hmm.
not on reservations, but in colonies, in their own communities. And then they were denied access to these areas after sundown. And I mean, there's this part where they play this first responder siren that had to, in the past, signaled that it was time, like the sun was going down,
Mm-hmm.
and you risked, what was it, jail time and or other things. And it doesn't go into what those other things are.
And this is, I guess, my issue sometimes when articles talk about subjects like this. Like, be very specific about the violence that people suffered, because when you don't, sometimes you kind of minimize the impact, right? And as heavy as some of the violence is to discuss, it needs to be addressed, right?
Mhm.
Because then you pretend it just didn't happen.
Yeah, it's out of sight, out of mind.
Mhm.
And if we're not being authentic and honest about what has happened, it not only loses its impact, but it's almost like we don't want to voice it. And sometimes we need to just say what it is to
Mhm.
really grow and heal from it and to educate. And that is so important. Like, yeah, these are hard topics. They're not easy, but they're never going to be resolved if we just keep kicking them down the road.
Mhm.
Ultimately, we're talking about what is part of genocide, what is part of racism. Like you said, there's so much lost. There's language, life, there's land, and
Mhm.
resources.
Mhm.
And that's one thing that I really tried to push when I was teaching Texas history. Is we talked about the U.S.-Mexican War. I wanted to make sure we got all perspectives,
Mhm.
and not just like different perspectives in the United States, because a lot of people will push, oh, Henry David Thoreau went to jail because he refused to pay his taxes, and he wrote civil disobedience in jail.
Mhm.
And that's another perspective, somebody who didn't support the U.S.-Mexican invasion. But there's also the people who lost land in the Southwest that were first Spanish citizens and then became Mexican citizens. There were the native people that were living along the Rio Grande that became Mexican citizens because of that, who they were just native because there wasn't a lot of Mexican government in that area.
Mhm.
And then there was the people who, like I always hear this said in Del Rio, is we didn't cross the border crossed us.
Mhm.
And that's because that land was taken. The whole area all the way to the Southwest, Colorado, California, all of that was taken. And it was a precursor to the Civil War. The U.S. Army was fighting itself. Like, you had two armies racing to sack Mexico City
Mhm.
because they weren't working together, and they were, in a lot of ways, they were fighting each other.
Hmm.
And we don't teach this to our students. Like we teach is like, oh, well, this is how we got the bottom part of Texas, and this is how we got Arizona and New Mexico. And it's all about, what we accomplished, what we conquered in terms of the US thought process about this history. But what about what was lost, what was taken, and people who didn't support it? Because it wasn't just people in the US that were for or against it. The people who it impacted is very important.
Hmm. And when healing depends on the land and you displace people from the land.
Right. What were we just talking about? How you only get good effects from honey from Mexico?
Oh, yeah, yeah. So my allergies are really bad, and they usually only get better when I get honey from Mexico because I was born in Mexico. It took me a while to learn that about like the honey only working from
Right.
Mexico,
Yeah.
which I never really associated. Honestly, I never put the pieces together till recently. But yeah, the land, so much of cultural beliefs, indigenous culture beliefs, when it comes to healing, it is associated with the land. And so if you displace a group of people from their land, you're causing a lot of trauma,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
So these are all perspectives I just want everybody to keep in mind because it's a different viewpoint. A lot of people don't have that connection to that land, right? Their pace of life is really quick. Like everything is on a time limit. So you don't have that connection to land as before.
Right.
So it's going to be a different perspective that they don't understand. So I ask all of our listeners to just keep that perspective in mind.
Right. And, just to kind of add to that, we live such a fast paced life that we don't even have sometimes to process, our lives itself in a good, healthy way. So sometimes it's just good to separate yourself from, the fast pace of life and try to be out there in nature.
Mm-hmm.
Like I know for myself, this last week, I got a chance to go out to West Texas, which I grew up in West Texas most of my life. It's dry climate. I love it
Mm-hmm.
compared to here in San Antonio. I tell my kids this all the time. You guys are okay with this climate because you were born here, but I'm so used to a dry climate like that. I'm still struggling to really climatize to it. And just being out there for, a couple of days was really great. Just being out there at sacred sites of our people, even if we were separated by a fence from a mining company, it was nice to be like in the presence of these places. Like went to go visit Sierra Blanca, and that was a really nice. It was nice to see because it's so beautiful out there, and I really wanted to get on the property because I've been told that there's grinding stones out there, like where our people used to grind cornmeal and make paint on these stones, and you can't get in there now because it's leased by a mining company. Somebody leased an entire mountain.
Mm-hmm. So keeping all that in mind for our listeners, I just have a question for our listeners for you to keep in mind is what ways do you use, right, to decompress from heavy trauma you face daily? That's something personal that only you will know, right? For some people, it will be nature. For other people, it will be to be with each other in community. Therapy, there are a lot of different ways that people do that, right? But most importantly, because I feel that the more people are connected to the land, the more they will heal themselves. And that's a lifelong journey.
Yeah. And so we encourage you, even after watching this video, do some of those practices that, that help you decompress, help you process, and, take care of yourself. These are hard subjects, but we encourage dialogue. If you want to comment, ask us questions, you can do so in the comments, but be sure to take a look at those articles and the resources that we put out there for you. We're all about helping people understand, having the tools to have healthy conversations and connect.
Yes. Thank you so much, guys.
Yes. And we'll see you guys next time. Again, this is the Future Generations podcast. I'm Pablo Mancias.
And I'm KP.
See you guys next time.